I never thought I'd have to run for my life at 73 years old. But there I was, slipping out the back door of my son's house at midnight, nothing but my purse and the clothes on my back. All because I found my daughter-in-law's planner left open on the kitchen counter that morning, with notes about putting me in a nursing home, canceling my insurance, and selling my mother's ring. My blood ran cold when I realized they weren't planning to care for me. They wanted me gone, permanently. What I didn't know then was that this desperate escape would unravel a web of lies spanning 27 years. A son I thought was dead, a grave I'd visited every month, empty, a family secret so dark that uncovering it would shatter everything I believed about the people I loved most. As I walked away from the only family I had left, I had no idea I was about to discover the most horrifying betrayal a mother could face. If you want to know what really happened that night and why my family was so desperately searching for me the next day, follow our channel for the full story. Like and subscribe if you've ever suspected someone close to you wasn't telling the whole truth. Comment where you're watching from and if you've ever had that gut feeling that something in your life just didn't add up. It was just supposed to be an ordinary Friday morning. All I wanted was to make my chamomile tea, the one thing that still brought me comfort in my son's house. The autumn chill had settled deep in Dayton, Ohio, making my old bones ache something fierce. My arthritis was flaring up something terrible in my hands, but I was determined to make that tea myself. The house was quiet, too quiet maybe. My son Robert had left for work at the bank around 7:30 like he did every morning. His wife Erin had gone to her fancy gym downtown, the one with those ridiculous smoothies that cost more than what I used to spend on groceries for a week. I shuffled into the kitchen in my worn slippers, the ones Robert always frowned at. "Mother, why don't you let us buy you new ones?" he'd say. But these were from Gerald, my late husband, the last Christmas gift he ever gave me before the cancer took him. The kettle was just starting to whistle when I noticed it, a light blue planner sitting open on the kitchen counter. I recognized it immediately as Erin's. She carried it everywhere, always writing in it with those expensive pens Robert bought her for their anniversary. I wasn't trying to snoop, I swear on my Bible. But the page was open, and my eyes just fell on it. That's when everything changed. That's when my world collapsed. The handwriting was rushed but neat. Erin's perfectly rounded letters that always reminded me of a school teacher's. Monday, confirm appointment with Green Hills Nursing Home. Tuesday, cancel her health insurance. Wednesday, sell grandmother's ring. I blinked, hoping I'd misread, hoping this was about someone else. But there, in the margin, was my name, Eleanor. My hands started trembling so badly I had to grip the counter. The kettle screamed behind me, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The same woman who had served me soup last night, who had smiled and asked about my medication. She was planning to throw me away like yesterday's trash. I finally reached for the kettle, my mind racing. How long had they been planning this? Was Robert part of it too? My own son? Of course he was. The pieces started falling into place. How he'd been organizing my finances last month. How he'd asked for my jewelry box to clean the pieces. The way they'd both been so insistent about getting my power of attorney papers signed. I didn't make my tea. Instead, I moved as quietly as I could back to my room, the guest room they'd reluctantly cleared for me when Gerald died last year. I grabbed my purse, making sure my wallet was inside. I took only what I absolutely needed, my heart medication, a change of clothes, and the photo of Gerald I kept by my bed. I put on my wool coat, the one Robert hated because it was outdated, and crept to the back door. My hands shook so badly I could barely turn the handle. But before I left, I stopped at the family bookshelf. There sat the Bible I'd given them for Christmas in 2003, the one they never read, still looking brand new after all these years. I pulled it out and slipped a folded note inside. "I know what you did in 1998. I didn't know why I wrote that exactly. It just came to me. Something about 1998 had always felt wrong. The year my younger son Daniel supposedly died in that accident. The closed casket. The way Robert had cried too much, too quickly. Something had never sat right with me, but I'd buried those feelings along with my son. Until now. I closed the back door silently behind me. The street was dark, the neighbors' houses all quiet. I had no plan, no destination. At 73, I was suddenly homeless, with only my purse and the clothes on my back. But I knew one thing for certain. If I stayed in that house another night, I'd never leave it alive. Whatever they were planning at that nursing home, it wasn't care. They wanted me gone, permanently. As I walked away from the only family I had left, my blood ran cold in my veins. But somehow my steps felt lighter than they had in years. I was afraid. I was alone. But for the first time in a long time, I was free. I walked until my knees screamed for mercy. The autumn chill bit through my thin wool coat, and I silently cursed myself for not grabbing something warmer. But when you're fleeing for your life, you don't exactly pack for comfort. Each step took me deeper into parts of Dayton I hadn't seen in decades. The city had changed so much. Buildings I once knew replaced by coffee shops with names I couldn't pronounce. Stores I'd frequented now empty shells with for lease signs. It felt like walking through a dream of my own past. Everything familiar yet distorted. By mid-morning, my feet were blistered and my breath came in short, painful gasps. I needed to rest. Ahead and nestled between a boarded-up barber shop and a pawn shop stood a small neighborhood church, St. Matthew's, the kind of place most people walk past without noticing. The red brick was crumbling at the corners, and one of the stained glass windows had a jagged crack running through the center of it. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, wincing at the loud creak that announced my entrance. The interior was dim and smelled of old hymnals and furniture polish. A few votive candles flickered near the altar, but otherwise, the place seemed deserted. That's when I noticed her, a woman sitting alone in the last pew, staring up at the broken stained glass window. She had steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and though I couldn't see her face fully, something in her posture spoke of a profound weariness, the kind that settles in your bones after years of carrying burdens too heavy to name. When she heard my footsteps, she turned. Her face was lined with deep creases around her eyes and mouth, not just age, but a map of sorrows. Yet when she saw me, she smiled. It was a small thing, that smile, but it reached her eyes in a way that made something in my chest unclench slightly. I slid into the pew beside her, my legs grateful for the rest. Neither of us spoke. I didn't offer my name. She didn't ask for it. We just sat there, two old women in an almost abandoned church, watching dust motes dance in the colored light from the broken window. After a while, she stood and gestured toward a side door. "There's a small kitchen in the back," she said softly, "and a cot in the attic if you need it." I should have been suspicious. Should have wondered why this stranger was offering shelter to someone she'd never met. But exhaustion had dulled my survival instincts, and something about her felt safe. That night, I slept in the church attic, wrapped in a musty blanket that smelled faintly of mothballs. The wind whistled through cracks in the old wooden beams, creating an eerie lullaby that somehow soothed my frayed nerves. For the first time since finding Erin's planner, I allowed myself to really cry, deep, heaving sobs that came from someplace so raw and wounded I hadn't dared touch it in years. But even as I drifted toward sleep, something nagged at me, the woman from the church. There had been something familiar about her face, something I couldn't quite place, like a word on the tip of my tongue or a melody half remembered. I woke the next morning to the tinny sound of a small radio playing downstairs. Sunlight streamed through the dusty attic window as I made my way down the narrow staircase, my joints protesting each step. The same woman sat at a small table in the back room, listening to the morning news. When she saw me, she silently pushed a chipped mug of coffee across the table. "Local authorities are searching for 73-year-old Eleanor Warren, who disappeared from her son's Oakwood home yesterday morning," the radio announcer was saying. "Family members say Warren suffers from early-stage dementia and may be disoriented. Her son, Robert Warren, spoke to reporters this morning." Then I heard his voice, my son's voice, smooth as butter and just as cold. "We're desperate to find her," he said. his words carefully measured. "We're offering a $5,000 reward for information leading to her safe return. Mother, if you're listening, please come home. We're worried sick." The woman reached over and switched off the radio. Her eyes met mine, questioning but not intrusive. I sat very still, my coffee untouched. They were looking for me, but they weren't worried. They were afraid. Afraid of what I might remember. Afraid of what I might tell. That afternoon, the woman returned to the church with an elderly man. He walked with a cane and wore a threadbare suit that had once been fine, but now hung loosely on his thin frame. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but he moved with the confidence of someone who had memorized every inch of his surroundings. He introduced himself as Pastor Mitchell. They brought me tea in a chipped cup. They didn't ask questions. They didn't demand explanations. They just sat with me in a silence that felt like the first real kindness I'd known in years. And for a moment, sitting there in that rundown church with two strangers who somehow weren't strangers anymore, I felt something stir inside me that I thought had died along with Gerald. Hope. By the third day in the church attic, I'd fallen into a strange rhythm. Pastor Mitchell would bring me breakfast, usually toast with a smear of butter and jam, sometimes an apple if the food pantry had been generous that week. The gray-haired woman who I'd learned was named Martha would sit with me in the afternoons, quietly knitting while I stared out the cracked window at the slice of Dayton skyline visible between buildings. They never pressed me for details, never asked why a woman my age was hiding in a church attic while her family offered rewards for her return. But the weight of my silence was becoming unbearable, pressing against my chest like a stone. That morning I watched a mother and child walk past the church, hand in hand. The little girl skipped every few steps, pigtails bouncing while her mother laughed at something she said. The sight sent a wave of longing through me, so intense I had to grip the windowsill to steady myself. "Pastor," I said when he came to collect my breakfast dishes, "may I use your telephone?" He nodded, his cloudy eyes somehow finding mine despite his blindness. "Of course. It's in my office downstairs. Martha can show you." The phone was an old rotary model, the kind I remembered from my youth. My fingers trembled as I dialed a number I hadn't called in years. Mary Lou Winters, my best friend from high school. We'd drifted apart after I married Gerald, but she'd sent a sympathy card when he passed. She was the only person outside my family who might help without asking too many questions. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, I panicked and hung up, my heart hammering against my ribs. What would I even say? "Hello, Mary Lou, it's Eleanor. I'm hiding from my son because I think he's trying to kill me. Can I stay with you for a while?" She'd think I was crazy. Or worse, she'd believe me, but call Robert out of concern, thinking she was helping. I sank into the pastor's worn leather chair, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. The office walls were lined with bookshelves sagging under the weight of theological texts. A cross hung above the desk, and beside it, a faded photograph of a much younger Pastor Mitchell standing beside a woman with kind eyes. "Did you reach your friend?" The pastor's voice startled me. He stood in the doorway, one hand resting on his cane, the other holding a mug that smelled of herbal tea. "No," I admitted. I hung up before she answered. He nodded as if this made perfect sense, and carefully made his way to the chair opposite me, setting the mug on the desk. "For you," he said. "Chamomile with honey. Martha says it helps with anxiety." I took the mug, warming my perpetually cold hands against it. "Thank you for everything." He settled into his chair, his cane resting against his knee. In the soft afternoon light filtering through the dusty blinds, I could see the man he must have been, strong, decisive, kind. "Mrs. Warren," he said quietly, "you don't need to tell me why you're here, but I sense you're running from something that will only stop hurting when you face it." His words struck me like a physical blow. Tears sprang to my eyes, hot and sudden. "I found my daughter-in-law's planner," I whispered. "She was making arrangements to put me in a nursing home, to cancel my insurance, to sell my mother's ring, the only thing of value I have left." The pastor didn't look surprised. He didn't rush to comfort me with empty platitudes or tell me I must be mistaken. He simply waited, giving me space to continue. "I left a note," I said, my voice gaining strength. "I wrote, 'I know what you did in 1998, but the truth is, I don't know exactly what happened, I just know something did.'" Pastor Mitchell leaned forward slightly. "And what happened in 1998, Mrs. Warren?" I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry despite the tea. I'd never spoken these doubts aloud, not even to Gerald before he passed. They'd lived in a dark corner of my mind, locked away, but never quite forgotten. My younger son Daniel died. At least that's what I was told. My voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and hollow. There was an accident, a car crash. The casket was closed at the funeral. They said his body was too damaged to view. The memory came rushing back. The funeral home's hushed lighting, the casket's gleaming mahogany surface, the overwhelming scent of lilies that had made me nauseated. Robert standing beside me, his arm around my shoulders, weeping so profusely that several mourners had commented on what a devoted brother he was. But something never felt right, I continued. Robert arranged everything. He insisted on the closed casket. He even identified the body himself, said he didn't want to put me through that trauma. I set the mug down, my hands shaking too badly to hold it steady. What if there was no body to identify? What if Daniel didn't die in that crash? The questions that had haunted me for decades finally took shape in words. Robert inherited everything when Daniel died. The family business, the insurance money, and Robert had always been envious of his brother. Pastor Mitchell sat very still, his blind eyes seeming to see right through me. "And this is why you left that note?" It wasn't a question. "Yes," I whispered. I think my son might have done something terrible, and now he's trying to get rid of me too." The pastor reached across the desk, his weathered hand finding mine with surprising accuracy. "Then, Mrs. Warren, I believe you have a decision to make, one you can no longer afford to postpone." I knew he was right. I couldn't hide in this church forever. Sooner or later, someone would recognize me from the news reports, or my medication would run out, or Robert would think to check the local churches. I had to act. I had to find out what really happened to Daniel, even if the truth destroyed what little I had left. The next morning arrived with a steady autumn rain that tapped against the attic window like impatient fingers. I'd barely slept, my mind churning with fragments of memories from 1998. Daniel's laugh, the phone call about the accident, Robert's hand on my shoulder at the funeral, squeezing just a little too hard. Pastor Mitchell knocked softly on my door around 9, dressed in a raincoat that had seen better days. "Mrs. Warren," he said, "if you're ready to start looking for answers, I might know where to begin." I wrapped myself in the cardigan Martha had given me, a faded blue thing with wooden buttons that didn't quite match. My heart fluttered like a trapped bird, but I steadied myself. "I'm ready." We took the bus across town, huddled beneath the pastor's umbrella when we had to walk. I wore a scarf over my hair and kept my head down, painfully aware that my face might be on the morning news. Pastor Mitchell moved with surprising confidence for a blind man, his cane tapping rhythmically against the wet sidewalk. "My late wife worked at Dayton Memorial for 40 years, he explained as we approached the sprawling hospital complex. "Pediatric ward. Made a lot of friends there. One of them still works in records. The hospital smelled exactly like every hospital I'd ever been in. Antiseptic and cafeteria food, with an undercurrent of something more desperate." We took the elevator to the basement level, where Pastor Mitchell navigated the labyrinthine corridors with the ease of familiarity. At last, we reached a door marked medical records. The pastor knocked, and a moment later, a woman with curly gray hair and reading glasses opened it. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of us. "James," she said, embracing the pastor, "it's been too long." "Nancy, this is my friend Eleanor," Pastor Mitchell said. "She's trying to piece together some family history from 1998. A delicate matter." Nancy glanced at me, her expression softening. "Come in," she said, ushering us into an office crammed with filing cabinets and humming computers. "Let me see what I can find." I gave her Daniel's full name and date of birth, my voice catching as I spoke. It had been so long since I'd said his name aloud. Nancy's fingers flew over her keyboard. She murmured after a moment. That's odd. I'm not finding a death certificate in our system. My breath caught. What does that mean? Could be nothing, she said, frowning at her screen. Records from that era were still being digitized. Let me check the archive. She disappeared into a back room, leaving Pastor Mitchell and me in uncomfortable silence. I studied the office, my eyes landing on a framed photo on Nancy's desk, a younger version of her standing beside a man in a lab coat, both smiling. James, I whispered to the pastor, is it possible Daniel could still be alive? Before he could answer, Nancy returned carrying a thick manila folder. Her expression had changed, guarded now, concerned. I found something, she said quietly, but it's not what I expected. She opened the folder and spread several documents on her desk. There's no death certificate for Daniel Warren, but there is a transfer record to a psychiatric facility, dated July 14, 1998. The date slammed into me like a physical blow, 3 days before Robert had called to tell me about the accident. There's more, Nancy continued, her voice gentle but firm. The transfer was authorized by Dr. Erin Reynolds, who was then a resident in the psychiatric department. Erin Reynolds? I repeated, the name burning like acid on my tongue. That's my daughter-in-law, Robert's wife. Nancy's eyebrows shot up. She didn't use the name Warren? They weren't married yet, I whispered. They met later, or at least. That's what they told me. My hands trembled as I reached for the document. There it was in black and white. My son's name, a patient ID number, and the signature of the woman who would later marry my other son, the woman who now wanted to put me in a nursing home. Can I see the rest? I asked, my voice stronger than I expected. Nancy hesitated, glancing at Pastor Mitchell. Technically, I shouldn't even be showing you this much without proper authorization, but she pushed the folder towards me. Take a quick look. I'll make some copies of the essential pages. I flipped through the documents with shaking fingers. Medical terminology swam before my eyes. Phrases like involuntary commitment and acute paranoid episode. According to these records, my son had been diagnosed with severe mental illness and institutionalized against his will. But Daniel had never shown any signs of mental illness. He'd been bright, driven, passionate about his work at the hospital's research department. He'd been developing a new treatment protocol that he'd been so excited about. Then my eyes fell on a photograph clipped to one of the pages. A staff ID badge. A young woman with dark hair and familiar green eyes stared back at me. Erin, but not the polished, perfect Erin who served me soup with a brittle smile. This was a younger version, her expression more open, less calculated. The photo was labeled Dr. Erin Reynolds, psychiatric resident, 1997-1999. My stomach lurched. All these years, I'd believed Robert and Erin met at a charity gala in 2001. That's what they'd told me. That's the story they'd constructed. But here was proof that Erin had known my family, had known Daniel years earlier, and somehow she'd been involved in committing him to a psychiatric facility just days before his supposed death. There's a letter here, Nancy said, pointing to a document near the back of the file. From the attending psychiatrist. It notes that the patient was admitted involuntarily at the request of family members. Family members, plural. Robert, I whispered, the pieces clicking into horrible place. Robert was involved. Nancy made copies of several key documents while I sat there, my world tilting on its axis. Pastor Mitchell's hand found mine, squeezing gently. Mrs. Warren, Nancy said as she handed me the copies, there's one more thing you should know. The transfer wasn't to just any facility. It was to Whispering Pines. Pastor Mitchell's grip on my hand tightened. What's Whispering Pines? I asked, though something in their expressions told me I wouldn't like the answer. It was a state psychiatric hospital, Nancy explained, her voice low. Out in the country, it had a reputation for experimental treatments. It closed down in 2007 after a series of patient deaths. I clutched the copies to my chest. feeling as though I might shatter into 1,000 pieces. My son, my bright, brilliant Daniel, had been sent to that place by his own brother and by the woman who would later become his sister-in-law. As we left the hospital, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy with clouds. I felt them pressing down on me, as heavy as the truth I now carried. "Pastor," I said as we waited for the bus, "I think I know what happened in 1998. Back at the church, I locked myself in the attic room. Rain had started again, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. I spread the hospital documents across the small wooden table, arranging them in chronological order with trembling hands. My reading glasses perched precariously on the tip of my nose as I leaned close, determined to miss nothing. Each page felt like another knife twisting in my heart. Admittance forms, treatment notes, medication logs, a paper trail documenting the betrayal of my son. My eyes burned from strain and unshed tears as I read report after report. The medical terminology swam before me, phrases like paranoid delusions and treatment-resistant symptoms. According to these records, Daniel had been experiencing hallucinations, making wild accusations about criminal activity at the hospital. But I knew my son. Daniel had always been the steady one, the logical one. Robert was the charmer, the one who could talk his way out of anything, while Daniel had been almost painfully honest. If Daniel had made accusations, there had been truth behind them. One note in particular caught my eye, written in careful, precise handwriting. Patient continues to make allegations regarding financial improprieties in hospital billing procedures. Claims his brother and Dr. It, name redacted, are falsifying insurance claims. Recommend increased sedation before scheduled transfer to Whispering Pines. I pressed my hand to my mouth, stifling a sob. Daniel had discovered something involving Robert and someone else at the hospital. And instead of being heard, he'd been silenced, labeled as paranoid, drugged. Outside, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the attic in stark white light. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. I gathered the papers with reverent care, as though they were fragile artifacts from an archaeological dig rather than the clinical documentation of my son's disappearance. Each page was a piece of a puzzle I'd never known needed solving. The floor creaked beneath me as I crossed to the small, sagging bed in the corner. I slipped the documents beneath the thin mattress, not trusting them anywhere else. Then I sat on the edge of the bed, my bones aching with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. For 27 years, I'd lived with the grief of Daniel's death. I'd visited an empty grave. I'd marked birthdays and holidays with silent tears. I'd kept his room unchanged until Robert had finally convinced me to sell the house. And all that time, had he been alive, locked away somewhere, believing his mother had abandoned him, the thought was too much to bear. I buried my face in my hands and wept, not the quiet, dignified tears of a woman who has known loss, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone whose world has been upended. My chest heaved with the effort of drawing breath between wails that seemed torn from some primal place deep within me. I don't know how long I cried. Long enough that the storm outside had moved on, leaving only a gentle patter of rain against the window. Long enough that my throat felt raw and my eyes swollen. A soft knock at the door startled me. "Mrs. Warren," Martha's gentle voice called. "I've brought you some soup." I quickly wiped my face with my sleeve, though there was no hiding the evidence of my breakdown. "Come in," I said, my voice a hoarse whisper. Martha entered with a tray, bearing a steaming bowl and a slice of bread. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of me, but she said nothing as she set the tray on the small table. "Thank you," I managed, "for everything. I don't know what I would have done if—" "Shh," she interrupted, sitting beside me on the bed. "You don't need to explain." We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle ticking of the small clock on the wall. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Martha finally asked. "At the hospital." I nodded, unable to form words around the lump in my throat. "And was it what you feared?" "Worse," I whispered. "So much worse." Martha took my hand in hers. her skin cool and dry against mine. "You're not alone in this, Eleanor. Whatever you've discovered, whatever you need to do next, you don't have to face it by yourself." Her kindness nearly undid me again. I'd been so alone for so long, even with Robert and Erin nearby, even when Gerald was still alive. The loneliness had become so familiar, I'd stopped noticing it, like background noise you eventually tune out. As Martha left me to my soup, I heard sounds from downstairs, footsteps moving across the wooden floor of the sanctuary. Heavy footsteps, not the careful tap of Pastor Mitchell's cane or Martha's light tread. Someone else was in the church. I froze, the spoon halfway to my mouth. Slowly, I set it down and crept to the attic door, pressing my ear against the worn wood. Voices drifted up from below, a woman's, sharp and insistent. "She has to be found before she opens her mouth. Do you understand what's at stake?" A man's voice responded, too low for me to make out the words. My blood turned to ice in my veins. I backed away from the door, moving as silently as possible to the small window. Could I fit through it if I had to? Where would I go if I did? The voices faded. Footsteps moved toward the door of the church, then silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the door, a heavy brass candlestick clutched in my hand like a weapon. Every creak of the old building made me flinch. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat. When dawn finally broke, casting pale gray light through the attic window, I uncurled my stiff fingers from around the candlestick. My back screamed in protest as I stood, my old joints locked from hours of immobility. I moved to gather my few belongings, determined to leave before I brought danger to the kind people who had sheltered me. But as I reached for my purse, I noticed something that hadn't been there the night before. A folded piece of paper, tucked partially beneath my bag. With trembling fingers, I opened it. The handwriting was cramped but neat, written in blue ballpoint pen. "Not everything that's dead is buried, and not all that glitters is gold." I stared at the cryptic message, my mind racing. The handwriting was vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. It wasn't Martha's flowing script or Pastor Mitchell's careful block letters. It was only when I turned the paper over that I saw the tiny initials in the corner. J.W. Jacob Warren, my grandson. Robert and Erin's son, Jacob, my 18-year-old grandson who barely spoke to me at family dinners, who always seemed to be watching, listening, with those solemn eyes that reminded me so much of Daniel's. I'd always attributed his quietness to typical teenage aloofness, but now I wondered, what did Jacob know? I slipped the note into my pocket and hurried downstairs, my heart racing. Pastor Mitchell was in the small kitchen, his sensitive fingers sorting through various tea bags. "I need to go to Westridge High School," I announced without preamble. The pastor's cloudy eyes turned in my direction. "Daniel's old school?" "Yes," I said, surprised he'd remembered this detail from our conversations. If Daniel was transferred in July 1998, there should be school records from that spring. Records that might tell me something about what was happening before he disappeared. An hour later, I was sitting in the reception area of Westridge High, a school that looked exactly as I remembered it from the few times I'd picked Daniel up after debate club. The same dull beige walls, the same trophy case near the entrance, even the same musty smell of floor wax and adolescence. I'd given Martha's name at the front desk, claiming to be researching my family history. The young receptionist, barely older than Jacob, had been skeptical at first, but softened when I mentioned I was looking for records from over 25 years ago. "My grandmother graduated from here," she said, her fingers clicking away at her keyboard. "Class of '85. She always says the place hasn't changed a bit." I managed a weak smile, my eyes darting nervously to the school security guard stationed near the entrance. Would he recognize me from the news? My picture had been splashed across local stations for days now. "Here we go," the receptionist said after what felt like an eternity. "Records from 1998. You're lucky. We just finished digitizing the archives from the 90s last year. What month are you looking for?" "May through July," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. "For Daniel Warren." More clicking. A slight frown creased her young forehead. "Warren, Warren. Ah, here. Daniel Warren, junior year. Honor roll, debate team captain, science club president. Quite the achiever. Pride swelled in my chest despite the circumstances. My brilliant boy. Can you tell me if there's anything unusual in his records? Absences, disciplinary notes, anything like that? She scrolled through whatever was on her screen. Nothing unusual. Perfect attendance until... that's odd. My heart stuttered. What is? His records just stop after June 15th. No final exams, no completion for the semester. She clicked a few more times. Oh, here's a note. Transferred for health reasons. But it's not until July 21st that the official transfer request was processed. July 21st, 4 days after Robert had called to tell me Daniel had died in a car accident. Can I see the actual document? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated. I'm not really supposed to, but it's such old stuff. I don't think anyone would mind. She turned the monitor slightly so I could see. There it was, an official school transfer form. Daniel's name and ID number. The reason for transfer, medical leave of absence, and his signature from his legal guardian, Robert Warren, not me, though I had been very much alive and legally responsible for my 17-year-old son. But what made my blood run cold was a small red stamp in the corner of the digital document. Do not release to mother. I must have made some sort of sound because the receptionist looked at me with concern. Are you all right, ma'am? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My own son had instructed the school not to tell me about Daniel's transfer, had orchestrated this whole elaborate deception. Is there anything else in his file? I managed to ask. Any indication of problems before this transfer? She turned the monitor back and scrolled some more. Let's see. Oh, there's a note from the school counselor dated June 1st. It says Daniel came to her concerned about ethical violations he'd witnessed during his hospital volunteer work. She referred him to the principal, but there's no record of a follow-up meeting. Ethical violations. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Daniel had discovered something at the hospital, something involving Robert, something serious enough that Robert had taken drastic measures to silence him. Thank you, I said, rising from my chair on unsteady legs. You've been very helpful. Outside, I leaned against the brick wall of the school, gulping in the crisp autumn air. My mind was racing, connecting dots that had been scattered across 27 years of lies. Daniel had volunteered at the hospital where Robert worked in administration. He'd discovered something, financial fraud, based on the psychiatric notes. He'd reported it to his school counselor, and within weeks, he'd been forcibly committed to a psychiatric facility, declared dead to his mother, and effectively erased from existence. I made my way back to the church, each step heavier than the last. Pastor Mitchell was waiting for me, a cup of tea already steaming on the table. You found something, he said. It wasn't a question. I sank into the chair across from him. Everything I feared and worse. Robert had Daniel declared mentally unstable and committed. He forged my signature on school documents. He erased his brother. Pastor Mitchell's weathered hand found mine across the table. And now he's trying to do the same to you. Yes, I whispered. But why now? After all these years? The pastor was quiet for a long moment. Perhaps, he finally said, something has changed. Something that threatens to expose what happened all those years ago. As if in answer to his words, the church door opened. Martha entered, her face grave. There's someone here to see you, she said. She says her name is Erin Warren. My heart nearly stopped. My daughter-in-law, the woman who'd helped commit Daniel, who'd planned to put me in a nursing home, was here, in this sanctuary I'd thought was safe. I won't see her, I said, my voice surprisingly firm. She can't be trusted. Martha exchanged a glance with Pastor Mitchell. She's not alone, Martha said quietly. She's with a young man. He says he's your grandson, Jacob, the note writer, the quiet watcher. She doesn't know he contacted you, Martha continued. I think he brought her here to force a confrontation. I stood, smoothing down my rumpled clothes with shaking hands. I'd been running for days, hiding in shadows, piecing together fragments of a truth too terrible to contemplate. Perhaps it was time to stop running. "Tell them I'll meet them in the sanctuary," I said. "But Pastor, please stay with me. I don't trust her, not for a second." As I walked toward the sanctuary, my legs felt leaden, but my spine straightened with each step. For 27 years, I'd believed the lie that my son was dead. I'd grieved him, mourned him, visited an empty grave. No more running, no more hiding. It was time for the truth, whatever the cost. The sanctuary was dim, illuminated only by a few flickering candles near the altar, and the gray afternoon light filtering through the stained glass windows. It smelled of old hymnals and furniture polish, a scent that had become familiar to me over the past few days. Under different circumstances, I might have found it comforting. Erin sat in the front pew, her back ramrod straight, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore a beige trench coat that probably cost more than Pastor Mitchell's monthly salary. Her dark hair pulled back in the severe bun she favored. Even from behind, I could sense the tension radiating from her. Jacob stood a few feet away, leaning against a pillar, his lanky teenage frame uncomfortable in the formal button-down shirt and slacks he wore. When he saw me, his eyes widened slightly, but he gave an almost imperceptible nod. Pastor Mitchell's hand was steady on my arm as we approached. The soft tap of his cane against the wooden floor announced our presence. Erin turned, and I was struck by how much older she looked than when I'd last seen her just days ago. Deep circles shadowed her eyes, and lines of strain bracketed her mouth. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Eleanor," she said, her voice carefully modulated. "Thank God you're safe. We've been worried sick." The false concern in her tone made my stomach turn. I remained standing, unwilling to sit beside her. Pastor Mitchell positioned himself slightly between us, his blind eyes somehow seeming to take in everything. "I know what you did," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. "To Daniel, in 1998. A flicker of something, fear, surprise, crossed her face before she composed herself. "I don't know what you're talking about. Daniel died in a car accident, you know that." "Stop lying!" Jacob's voice cracked through the silence like a whip. "I found the letters. I know Uncle Daniel is alive." Erin's head snapped toward her son, her expression hardening. "Be quiet, Jacob. You don't understand what you're talking about." "I understand perfectly," he shot back. "I understand that you and Dad had Uncle Daniel committed to a psychiatric hospital, that you faked his death, that you've been keeping this secret my entire life." I stared at my grandson in shock. "You knew? How long have you known?" Jacob's eyes, so like Daniel's, met mine. "I found letters in Dad's study last year, letters from Whispering Pines, monthly reports about a patient. They never used his full name, just DW, but there were old photos tucked in with them. A man who looked just like the pictures of Uncle Daniel in our family albums, only older." Erin stood abruptly, her composure cracking. "This is absurd. I'm taking you both home right now. Eleanor, you're clearly not well. And Jacob, you're grounded until further notice." Pastor Mitchell stepped forward. "I think everyone should take a seat. Mrs. Warren has something to show you, Erin." With trembling hands, I pulled the hospital documents from my purse. "Records don't lie, Erin. I know you worked at Dayton Memorial in 1998. I know you were involved in committing Daniel to Whispering Pines. I know Robert told me his brother was dead while you were signing transfer papers." Erin's face drained of color. She sank back onto the pew, her perfect posture crumbling. For a long, tense moment, the only sound in the sanctuary was the distant patter of rain against the windows. "You don't understand," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then help me understand," I replied, sitting beside her, keeping the width of the pew between us. "Help me understand why you stole my son from me, why you let me grieve for 27 years while he was alive." Erin pulled a silver cigarette case from her coat pocket, her fingers trembling slightly as she extracted a cigarette. Pastor Mitchell made no comment as she lit it, the smell of tobacco curling through the sacred space. "Your son never wanted you to know," she said after taking a long drag, deliberately blowing the smoke away from me. even though she knew how much I detested cigarettes. He thought it would kill you. That's a lie, I said, anger flaring hot in my chest. Why would Daniel want me to think he was dead? Because of what Robert had done, she replied, tapping ash onto the stone floor. Because of what they'd both get pulled into if the truth came out. Jacob moved closer, perching on the edge of the pew in front of us. What truth? Erin's gaze fixed on a point in the distance, as if she could see through the church walls to the past she'd tried to bury. Robert was embezzling from the hospital, she said flatly. Insurance fraud, billing for procedures that never happened, medications that were never dispensed. It started small, but by '98 he'd taken almost $2 million. The amount struck me like a physical blow. $2 million. More money than I could even comprehend. Daniel discovered it, she continued. He was volunteering in the billing department that summer, some kind of school credit. He found discrepancies, started asking questions. So Robert had him committed, I whispered, the horror of it washing over me anew. His own brother. Erin took another long drag of her cigarette. I was just a psychiatric resident. I didn't know the full story at first. Robert told me Daniel was having paranoid delusions, that he needed help. I believed him. I helped with the paperwork. And then? Pastor Mitchell prompted when she fell silent. And then I met Daniel, she said softly, at Whispering Pines. I was assigned to his case. It didn't take long to realize he wasn't delusional at all. He was brilliant, lucid, terrified. My heart contracted painfully. But you didn't help him. You didn't tell anyone the truth. By then, I was implicated too, she said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her tone. I'd signed the commitment papers. If I came forward, my career would be over before it began. And Robert, he could be very persuasive when he wanted to be. I thought of my older son, handsome, charming Robert with his easy smile and silver tongue. How easily he'd always gotten his way, even as a child. At first, Erin continued, I was just the nurse checking in on him. Then I started bringing him books, extra food. We talked, for hours sometimes. A cold realization dawned on me. You fell in love with him? She nodded, a single tear tracking down her cheek. I did. God help me, I did. Jacob made a small, choked sound. While you were dating Dad? While you were helping him keep Uncle Daniel locked up? It wasn't like that. Erin snapped, suddenly defensive. Your father and I weren't serious yet, and I wanted to help Daniel. I tried to get him released, but Robert threatened to expose my role in the commitment. I would have lost my medical license, faced criminal charges. So instead, I said, bile rising in my throat, you married his brother, the man who destroyed his life. Erin stubbed out her cigarette on the stone floor. I made a choice, she said, her voice hollow. A terrible choice. But Daniel, he understood. He told me to do it, to marry Robert, to keep an eye on him. I stared at her in disbelief. My son would never ask that of anyone. He was protecting you, she insisted. If the truth came out, Robert would have implicated him in the fraud, made it look like they were in it together. Daniel couldn't bear the thought of you learning that one son was a criminal and the other was in a psychiatric institution. He thought it would break you. The weight of her words crushed down on me. All these years, all these lies. Where is he now? I demanded, my voice breaking. Where is my son? Erin looked up, her eyes meeting mine directly for the first time. Sunset Valley Care Center, about 40 miles from here, under the name David Wilson. I clutched the edge of the pew, feeling as though I might faint. Is he all right? He's alive, she said simply. That's the best I can offer. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat, thundering in my ears like a drum. My son was alive. After 27 years of grief, of visits to an empty grave, of wondering if I could have somehow prevented the accident, he was alive. Take me to him, I said. Now. The drive to Sunset Valley Care Center felt eternal. Pastor Mitchell insisted on coming with us, a silent guardian in the back seat of Erin's sleek black sedan. Jacob had wanted to come too, but Erin had been adamant. This reunion shouldn't have an audience. I was secretly relieved. I didn't know what condition we would find Daniel in. and I didn't want my grandson's first memory of his uncle to be potentially traumatic. We drove in tense silence, the wipers beating a hypnotic rhythm against a light drizzle. The Ohio countryside rolled past my window, fields already harvested for the season, skeletal trees stretching bare branches toward a pewter sky. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside me. My son was alive. The thought kept repeating in my mind like a prayer, like a miracle I was afraid to fully believe, in case it was snatched away. "How often do you visit him?" I finally asked, breaking the suffocating silence. Aaron's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Once a month, sometimes twice if I can manage it without Robert noticing. And in all these years, you never thought I deserved to know." The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. "It wasn't my decision to make," she replied, her tone carefully neutral. "Daniel was adamant that you not know. He said you'd had enough heartbreak in your life." I thought of Gerald's slow, painful death from cancer just a year earlier, of the decades I'd spent believing one son was dead while the other gradually became a stranger to me, of all the Mother's Days and Christmases and birthdays marked by Daniel's absence. "That wasn't his choice to make either," I said softly. "I'm his mother." Erin's mouth tightened, but she said nothing more. Sunset Valley appeared on the horizon, a sprawling complex of low red brick buildings surrounded by carefully tended gardens now faded with autumn. It looked more like a small college campus than the institutional facility I had feared. Erin parked in a visitor spot near the main entrance. "I should warn you," she said as she turned off the engine. "He's not the Daniel you remember." A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. "What do you mean?" "The medications they gave him at Whispering Pines. They were experimental, powerful antipsychotics that were never approved for long-term use. They left him with some effects." "Effects?" My voice sounded distant to my own ears. "Tremors sometimes, periods of withdrawal. His speech can be halting." She hesitated. "And his appearance has changed. The years haven't been kind." I squared my shoulders, gathering what remained of my strength. "I don't care. He's my son." The reception area was bright and welcoming, with comfortable seating and cheerful artwork on the walls. A young woman at the front desk smiled as we approached. "Dr. Reynolds, we weren't expecting you until next week." "Change of plans, Melissa," Erin replied smoothly. "This is David's mother and their family pastor. They'd like to see him." If the receptionist found this unusual after 27 years of David Wilson having no mother, she didn't show it. She simply checked her computer and directed us to the east wing of the facility. We walked down a sunlit corridor lined with large windows overlooking a courtyard where a few residents sat bundled against the autumn chill. Pastor Mitchell's cane tapped softly against the polished floor, a rhythmic counterpoint to the pounding of my heart. "He has his own room," Erin explained as we turned a corner. "Private bath, sitting area. I made sure he had the best accommodations possible." Was I supposed to thank her for this small mercy? For ensuring my son had a nice cage? I said nothing, saving my words for Daniel. "Room 237. The door was partially open. Erin knocked gently. "David, it's Erin. I've brought someone to see you." She pushed the door wider and I stepped into the room, my legs suddenly feeling like they might give way beneath me. A man sat in an armchair by the window, a book open in his lap. He looked up as we entered, his movements deliberate, careful. White hair, so much like Gerald's in his final years, framed a face lined by time and hardship. A neatly trimmed beard covered his jaw and chin, but his eyes, those eyes I would have known anywhere, the same deep blue that had gazed up at me from a crib, that had sparkled with intelligence and humor throughout his childhood, that had flashed with determination when he announced he wanted to become a doctor. "Daniel," I whispered, his name a prayer on my lips. He stared at me, unmoving. For a terrible moment I feared he didn't recognize me, that whatever they had done to him had erased his memories along with his freedom. Then slowly, the book slipped from his fingers. His hands, oh God, they were trembling, reached out toward me. "Mom?" His voice was rough from disuse, a ghost of the confident tone I remembered. "Is it really you?" I crossed the room in 3 steps. falling to my knees before him, gathering his trembling hands in mine. "Yes, sweetheart, it's me. I'm here." He made a sound, half sob, half laugh, as tears began to stream down his weathered face. I reached up to touch his cheek, feeling the wet warmth of his tears against my palm. "How?" he asked, his voice breaking on the single syllable. "I found out," I said simply. "I found out what they did to you." His eyes darted to Erin, who stood in the doorway, her face a mask of carefully controlled emotion. "You told her?" "She figured it out herself," Erin replied. "She's been staying at a church downtown, investigating." Daniel's gaze returned to my face, studying it as if memorizing every new line, every change the years had carved into me. I thought you believed I was dead." "I did," I said, my voice catching. "For 27 years, I thought I'd lost you. I visited your grave every month. I brought flowers on your birthday." His face crumpled at this, decades of carefully maintained composure shattering like glass. He leaned forward, his forehead coming to rest against mine, and wept, deep, gut-wrenching sobs that seemed torn from the very core of his being. I held him as I had when he was a little boy frightened by thunder, as I had when he'd broken his arm falling from a tree, as I had when his first girlfriend had broken his heart. I held my son, this stranger who was still the child of my heart, and I wept with him. Behind us, I heard the soft click of the door as Erin and Pastor Mitchell withdrew, giving us this sacred moment of reunion. "I wanted to tell you," Daniel said when he could finally speak again. "So many times I wanted to reach out, but Robert, he threatened to hurt you if I ever contacted you." "Oh, my boy," I whispered, stroking his white hair. "What did they do to you?" "It doesn't matter now," he said, his trembling hands gripping mine with surprising strength. "You're here. After all this time, you're finally here." We talked for hours, filling in the vast, empty spaces of 27 years apart. He told me about Whispering Pines, the experimental treatments, the isolation, the years of being told that his memories of fraud were delusions, how Erin had eventually arranged his transfer to Sunset Valley, a place that at least treated him with dignity. I told him about his father's death, about the lonely years in the house that had once been full of family, about how Robert had gradually taken control of my life until I was little more than a ghost in my own existence. As darkness fell outside his window, I finally asked the question that had been burning in my heart since I'd learned he was alive. "Why, Daniel, why did you agree to this? Why didn't you fight harder?" He looked at me with those familiar blue eyes, now clouded with decades of regret. "Because I was afraid of what Robert would do if I didn't play along. Not to me. I could have endured anything they did to me. But to you. He knew my weakness was always you, Mom. He knew I'd do anything to protect you." I thought of the note I'd left in the Bible before fleeing Robert's house. "I know what you did in 1998. How those words, written on pure instinct, had contained more truth than I could have imagined. "Well," I said, taking his trembling hands in mine once more, "it's time to stop protecting me. It's my turn to protect you now. Sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, even when everyone tells us we're mistaken." I could have stayed in my son's house that morning, dismissed what I saw in that planner, and accepted the fate they had planned for me. But something deep inside, that voice we too often ignore, told me to run. What would you have done? Would you have had the courage to walk away from everything familiar at 73 years old, with nothing but uncertainty ahead? The truth is, it's never too late to fight for your dignity, for justice, or for the people you love. 27 years my son Daniel lived in that facility while I grieved at an empty grave. 27 years of lies that might have continued forever if I hadn't found that planner. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't protecting someone from painful truths. It's having the courage to uncover those truths, no matter how devastating they might be. What truth in your life might be waiting for you to discover it? If this story touched your heart or made you think about the secrets in your own family, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Follow our channel for more stories of courage, betrayal, and the extraordinary strength we find in our darkest moments. Remember, even when it seems like everyone is against you, trust that inner voice. It might just save your life, or someone else's.